You have to admit that was a pretty interesting opening, wasn't it? That's what happens when we start at the very last second. I was uploading something and everything went crazy. Welcome to the show, everyone. My name is Martin Willis, and I'd like to dedicate this show to a longtime listener. It was back in 2012. I got an email from a gentleman named Lea MacDonald up in Canada, and hilarious, absolutely hilarious. And people may remember him from the chat room. He was in the chat room many years, cracking some wonderful jokes. He passed away not that long ago this year. Now, Lea was someone that was a firefighter himself. He did a dedication for 9/11, the people of that. And I'm going to play that poem that he wrote, him reciting it at the very end of the show. It's about 4 minutes, and it's quite moving. It's called Calling All Angels, and it's for fallen firefighters, which he was one. He was a captain in the fire department and up near Ontario. He himself was in a building that collapsed, and he thought he wasn't going to make it. He told me the details quite a while ago about it, and he was rescued by fellow firefighters, and just, he thought that was the end. Well, unfortunately, this year, cancer took him, and he tried to fight it. I talked to him many times on the phone and through email and chat on Facebook, and he was extremely optimistic that he was going to beat it. He said, "The doctors are telling me that I'm dying, and I don't believe them. I feel so good." And he really had a great attitude. But you may remember him from all the funny stuff that he would put in chat over the years. And for instance, I have this, he wrote me this email here. "Hey, Martin." Yeah, well, first of all, he wrote me in the subject line. Fortunately, it doesn't show there. He said he had a new tagline for me. Instead of "keep your eyes to the sky," I should say, "always stare up there." And then he said he was listening tonight. This is back in 2016, but he couldn't get into the chat room. And so he was typing telepathically. So that was a kind of emails and texts and things that I would get from him. Anyway, I hope he rests in peace. He was a great man. So a little bit about the show tonight. We have a great guest, a repeat guest. I always love having him on. He's always been very active in the UFO world, Peter Robbins, and I consider him a good friend as well. He's been traveling all over the place. He's going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about something pretty interesting, and it's Wilhelm Reich and what he did and his connection to UFOs, the cloud busting machine and all that stuff. So, and then also we're going to talk a little bit about what's changed since the last time Peter was on. It's been a while. He was on my 10th anniversary, but it's been a while since he's been a guest on my show. And if you support our show, I want to thank you very much. Anyone can do that. You just go over to Podcast UFO, and on the menu bar, you see a support us link for I think it's $2 or more a month. You can help us out. And this week, the blog by Charles Lear is a photo of a UFO and humanoid. It's probably kind of an iffy photo. It's a pretty good looking photo too. But anyway, check that blog out. That'll be an audio blog, as they always are, up on YouTube and in the podcast stream. So that is enough for me. Very happy to bring in my guest, Peter. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thanks, Martin. Good to be back with you.
Yes, always, Peter. And you just told me you were all over the place, all over the world, actually, England and everywhere. So, but you're pretty active in the UFO community. And I'm so sorry I missed you up in Exeter. It's always fun getting there. It was on Labor Day weekend. And getting out and back to Rockland, Maine, where I live, the traffic, you might as well just park your car somewhere. It's really bad. So I didn't come down because of that. But how was it this year?
Actually, we went in with a great deal of concern. Like every other event on the planet, it's been pushed back for 2 full years. And it's, I think, my sentimental favorite UFO event on the yearly calendar. I'm honored to be a co-founder of the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO Festival and Conference. And it's distinguished by the fact that once all the bills are paid, speakers receive their honorariums, the hall is covered, every cent of profit goes to children's services of the greater Exeter area, the seacoast area there, and always administered by the Kiwanis, a great local chapter, which also organizes the events in question. And we just didn't know whether people would be returning or returning in numbers. And everybody from the food concession people to those who print up the posters to, the bookstore and all the local merchants really were not sure. But I think overall people took a chance, and it turned out probably to be the most successful one that we've had so far. I know on Saturday, they clocked over 600 people who were either in the town hall listening to the talks or taking the tour of the location of the events of the incident at Exeter. I think everybody had a great time as well. And that was, I think, my last live event for the season right now. But I started the year, like most of us, a little cross-eyed and homebound, and received an invitation to speak at a UFO conference in Edinburgh, Texas, which really interested me because it's 20 minutes from the border with Mexico. I have never been to that part of Texas, and I've never been to Mexico. And I thought how interesting to have a cultural experience of that kind superimposed on the UFO subject. And I wasn't disappointed. It was a first-rate conference organized by the city. We were all treated great, had a terrific time, and hopefully talk was well received. In May, that was in April. In May, I spoke in Hull, England, another conference that had been pushed back for 2 years, and another great success, sponsored by the Outer Limits magazine, an online monthly publication. From there, I went on a completely non-UFO related job and some certainly R&R to a small island in the Bahamas for 2 weeks.
Yeah, it
Then
sounds just terrible. Just terrible.
I know somebody's got to do it, Martin.
That's right.
And it was very welcome, although it was in part to document the incredible damage done by a hurricane
Oh,
that
yes.
hit about 3 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
And I've never seen anything like it. It was truly a war zone with nature. This island is a particularly poor one. It is not a touristed island much, and people are still living amid the carnage.
Jeez.
Obviously, we're off topic here, but just to say that at one point, a tidal surge swept across a good part of this island, and in some cases carried things like containers, half a mile or so. And one thing that stood out for me was a good-sized boat, larger than a tugboat, sitting in the middle of a farm field,
Yeah.
Half a mile inland. Anyway,
Crazy.
I was very honored to speak at this year's MUFON Symposium in Denver in August. And again, just a week and a half ago, ending my live world tour for the year in Exeter, New Hampshire.
Excellent. Wow. That's a lot. Now, I wanted to tell you, I think I sent you an email, but you were probably off busy, and I don't think I heard back from you. Maybe again, you were just busy, and that happens sometimes. But I spoke to someone that had a sighting so much like your childhood sighting that I was trying to connect you somehow with this person. I don't know. You
I
may
must
not
have
even.
missed it.
Yeah,
Please resend it.
yeah, I'll try to find it. But it was so almost identical to what you said. The only difference was it was a schoolyard type of situation. And but the silver disc, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there were 3 of them, and it just seemed like there was so much that was close to yours that I wanted to connect you to. And now that I brought that up, I know you've told it probably 10 times on my show over the years, but if you could, in a nutshell, can you talk about that particular sighting, because that's really what got you interested in the topic. I know you put it away for years and popped back into your life, right?
Yeah, well, it became the most massive repressed memory of my life.
Hmm.
Although I do have to joke with people that if I have other repressed memories, I don't remember them. Um, but this was
Yet,
a
yeah.
very unambiguous daylight sighting when I was 14 years old, growing up on Long Island, about 30 miles east of Manhattan, um, on a late June morning with one of my sisters. And we observed 5 silvery white disc shaped objects coming in at a high rate of speed and stopping over the neighbor's house. And they were oval. They were in a very precise V as in Victor type formation. We could make out regular, slightly lighter detailing around the edge of each that we could only read as windows when we finally discussed this more than 14 years later. And it really overloaded my circuits. I was a very naive kid growing up in a simpler time. I really didn't have an interest in this subject. I certainly had other interests, but the only connection I had with UFOs was the B movies that I grew up on and would occasionally see, with my friends at our local theater on a Saturday afternoon. But um, it was really too much for me to deal with, and I packed it away quite well. Uh, More than 14 years later, a number of things triggered that memory, and it came roaring back like a freight train. It was a very difficult afternoon for me because you think you're having a major mental episode. How could you possibly repress the most profoundly memorable memory of your life on a certain level? But we can do it. And I really gave some thought before I telephoned my sister because I did not want to just blurt out what I remembered and have her say yes or no. That would not really constitute confirmation for me. So by the time I called her, I was able to just say I've had a memory return, set the scene, the time of day, the weather, where we were standing in relation to each other, and she just cut me off and said, I know what you're talking about. And we very quickly dispensed with the matter. But that's when my life completely changed. And she said, but there's more. And then went on to describe to me a series of very conscious memories, things she had never forgotten, but never felt compelled to talk about either, of what we would now regard as extremely archetypical, classic UFO abduction related memories of being lifted into the air, of being walked through a curved metal hallway, of beings that we would now call grays, although that term didn't exist when we first discussed this back in the 1970s. And I thought for a moment, my sister must be going crazy or not telling the truth. But then you catch yourself, say, 5 seconds ago it was all right for 5 disc shaped objects close enough to see windows on them to be hanging over the Parker's house, but Helen's crazy. And, Martin, people say the phrase, my life changed overnight. Mine changed in about 90 seconds. I really was lucky enough as a young person to know what I wanted to do and be good at it. And by the time this memory resurfaced, I was in my late 20s and I was pursuing a career as a painter in Lower Manhattan and living that dream. But
Hmm.
this became an obsession. What had happened to my sister? And never having heard of, I didn't know there were UFO conferences. I didn't know there were people like me now who did this, as fairly serious work, or it was a land unto itself. But my career train kind of jumped the tracks. And here I am all these years later doing this.
Right. Now I know your sister was beautiful. She was also a rock star, and unfortunately we lost her um, over the years, and it was a terrible loss. So, but do I have that right? Wasn't
You do.
she a
Helen
musician and
was,
and doing pretty well as a musician?
yes, Helen was a gold and platinum record award winning singer songwriter who wrote
That's amazing.
songs for
Wow.
the Blue Oyster Cult, performed with her band for 10 years in the greater New York area. Um, a marvelous lyricist and an electrifying performer who was one of the vanguard of that first wave of what became called punk music. I mean, she opened for the Talking Heads, for Iggy, for Ramones, um,
Wow.
kind of the pantheon. And without realizing that you were kind of at a moment in pop music history, I went along for the ride and was. But she passed in 2000 following complications from a surgery. But her music
Mm,
is out there, and she had a lot of courage in being a very public person about this subject back when there weren't a lot of them.
right. Is that right? See this? Someone just said Helen Wheels.
That's it.
Is
That was her
really?
performing name. Yeah.
Yeah.
Having nothing to do, as people occasionally ask, with the Paul McCartney song of that name, which came
Oh
out
yes.
several years before. She was christened Helen Wheels, a pun on the fact that she could be hell on wheels, by the lead singer of one of the other original whole punk vanguard bands, the Dictators. Handsome Dick Manitoba gave her that name, and it stuck.
How about that? I'm having a little bit of technical issues, Peter, and so I'm going to ask you a question and have you talk. I'm going to leave the studio and come back in. You're not going to go anywhere, but so I'm going to see if that will make a difference if I reboot or something like that.
Sure.
So let's. I don't want to miss anything. We're going to talk about Wilhelm Reich a little bit, but so I'm trying to think of what can get you on for a topic that you can speak on for a while. And I know you're very good at speaking about anything. So I guess I'll ask you this: when you go to UFO conference, what is the type of your subject that you pick and about at a UFO conference? Like you said, you did in Texas and one in England and stuff like. So if you wouldn't mind just addressing a little bit of that, and I'll be right back. Is that all
Sure.
right? All right. Okay. I'll be right back.
Well, following on Martin's request, the Edinburgh UFO Festival and Conference, um, again, maybe 20 minutes from the Mexican American border, and a part of America that has been culturally Mexican American for 150 years. And it was a wonderful culture to be immersed in. And I had given them, as I sometimes do when I'm asked to speak, half a dozen, 8 different subjects that I could lecture on, or if they had something in particular they wanted me to discuss. And they chose what was the most well known and best documented UFO incident in the history of the Soviet Union, barring the Tunguska event in 1908, which is still somewhat mysterious. This happened in the Russian city of Voronezh, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, in 1989, with the landing of a fully articulated, unidentified flying object, a machine of undetermined origin, in a public park in this city, which is about 300 miles southeast of Moscow. And afternoon time, as school was getting out, a lot of kid witnesses, a lot of adult witnesses, um, local investigators coming into the area almost immediately and collecting samples, documenting the anomalous changes to the organic material that this incident, so to say, bumped up against. But they had asked me to give the talk in part because it was a younger audience and they wanted it to be something of a history lesson because the event superimposed itself on the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And I ended up corresponding for several years and becoming quite close with a Russian professor, also ufologist, in Voronezh, and it made it kind of a unique investigation. Otherwise, the talks that I gave this year were variations on a subject that has fascinated me for decades and that I've spoken on occasionally, but I finally came back to and pulled together as a full documented presentation. And it's something that's occurred to most people who have some interest in UFOs, but then you move on to other things, which is the ridicule attached to the subject has been ferocious for most of the time since the beginning of the modern age of UFOs in 1947, when there are earlier events, but that's when it's officially dated from by most folks, and how it came to pass that almost instantaneously in the summer of 1947, the American public, and by extension, the Western world, had their brains rewired in a way to respond to somebody simply stating that they had seen something in the sky that was unusual, that they had never seen before, that they didn't recognize, that maneuvered in a manner that they were unfamiliar with, which seems like a perfectly logical thing to be curious about, but to respond not by saying or thinking, gee, that's interesting, I wonder what it was too, but by responding or thinking, what's wrong with this person? Are they mentally ill? Do they want to feel special? Do they think this is going to make them wealthy or famous? Do they have a desire to con me? Is this some kind of hoax? Are they a member of a cult? None of it makes sense at all. And so I really started to dig into it and to try to find the actual mechanisms. And I think I did. And more, I think I'm able in that presentation and the paper that I wrote to trace it down to key individuals within the Truman administration and within the major world of mass media, which at the time was dominated by newspapers. It's 1947. Anyway, once I finished my final variation on the presentation in Exeter, that gets filed and move on to other material that I'm developing for my own curiosity and research and for future presentations.
Excellent. Well, yes, I'm sorry I couldn't. I mean, I did reboot, and it seems much better now, and everything seems fine. But I thought the days of rebooting computers was over. You know, remember we used to have to reboot them all the time.
Yeah, even just the word alone sounds so wonderfully dated in my ear.
Yeah.
I think, just as a footnote, Exeter TV, the local television network in Exeter, New Hampshire, they ran the AV and they filmed all the talks. And I think this week, and I guess it's exetertv.com, I'm not sure, they're starting to make them available, the talks by the various presenters. And it was a terrific group of presentations, I must say.
Yeah, my friend Paul Eno's always there. Was Ben there this year too as well?
Yes,
Yeah.
they did their usual radio show live from the event.
Yeah.
With all of the speakers and Q&A, and gave a terrific talk together. Once again, as always, they are perennials at this event and much beloved.
You know, it's something, you know, you talk about COVID and what it's changed and everyone holding back. And same thing, I'm on my way to Phoenix later on, actually doing my second talk on the UFO topic in Shag Harbor coming up October 1st.
Terrific.
And in Phoenix, I'm going to help. And my friend Donna and I are both going out there. And it's going to be a lot of fun, like it always is. But it's been, was it 3 years? It's been 2 years, 2 years that it was virtual. And I think the same thing's going to happen there. I think there's going to be a lot of people coming. And as I mentioned to the last show, that if you're going to be out in Phoenix, please do send me an email at martin@podcastufo.com. And I'm sorry I haven't responded to the people that wrote last week, but it doesn't mean I'm going to put you all in one area and I'm going to text you all, and it'll be nice to catch up with people. And I may do a round robin. I'd like to invite people to be in the audience of the round robin as well. But I do think that, you know, I mean, there's going to be some people wearing masks. I know there's still a problem. It's not like this thing has gone away. There's, you know, I had people, I was at an estate sale. I had an estate sale last weekend, and, you know, there were some people that walked in and not wearing a mask. And the day before, the woman was in her car and said she had COVID, and I recognized her. She came in without a mask. So, I mean, with that type of thing,
That's just irresponsible.
yeah,
Incredibly irresponsible and
right.
greedy too.
Yeah, in a way, yes. But anyway, I think that for the most part, that these conferences, people have, spent a few years and they're dying to get out, and I think they're going to be successful. So it doesn't surprise me at all about the 600 people. But I want to ask you this: were there people at the end? Because that's meaning that they're really interested, and I think that there are more people interested than ever before at this time.
Yes. There certainly were, Martin, although almost always noticeably less. In this
Hmm.
case, the last presenter finished at 5 o'clock each day. And that second day, most folks are traveling, many of them by car, and in some cases, considerable distances. I, like some of the other speakers, stayed over that final Sunday night because I and a colleague of mine had a 6 or 7 hour drive back to the Ithaca, New York area in central New York State. So not something you want to start out at 6 in the evening. But again, a very successful conference, very well run. And as I understand it, we raised more for children's services than we ever have before. And it's usually
Excellent.
pretty considerable. So we're all very proud of that.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'll try to make it next year.
Good.
And I've said that I've been there a few times. The last time I was there, Stanton Friedman was there, and you'll remember that one. And it was so funny. These young girls went around him with aliens, big blow up aliens. Were all excited. He was friendly to everybody. It was great. It was great. So I want to talk a little bit because I did some homework yesterday because I wanted to talk about Wilhelm Reich and his cloud busting machine, his connection to UFOs. I know you did some work on that, and I've always wanted to talk to you about that because his last place was right in the state of Maine. So my friend and I drove up there yesterday,
Yeah.
and here's that was his home, right?
That is, the building is called Organon.
Right.
It
Yeah.
it was his home, but it was also his laboratory, his observatory, and his art studio, and examination rooms and library. In fact, it was designed in such a functional, organic way that every visit I've made there, I just am taken aback at how sensible, how really brilliant in a quiet sort of way the structure is. You move from environment to environment. It's built mostly with these old field stones from the original farmhouse that it replaced on the estate that Reich bought
Hmm.
in the early 1950s when he moved to Maine. And it, I should say here that I first was introduced to the writings of Wilhelm Reich when I was still a teenager. And the science that he pioneered, which he called orgonomy, people get caught up on words, especially if the content can make them feel uneasy. And
Yeah.
a lot of, the root word organism, etc. Um, it's the
Orgasm.
science of, yeah, that
Right.
too.
Yeah.
The science of how energy functions in the
Mhm.
living and the non-living realms. And as a result, in his 45-year or so exploration, as a scientist, as a psychotherapist, as a social historian, as a brilliant observer of the human condition, if you're not aware of that the thread that runs through everything is about the study of energy, it seems kind of slipshod or helter skelter. He researched and explored areas as diverse as weather formation, human behavior, cancer formation, um, the raising of healthy children, how galaxies form, how organisms split, um, fascism versus democracy. But it was like a gun sight straight through these areas of study, the last of which he focused on in his last years, having to do with the UFO phenomena, fairly recent at that time. But just forewarned, there is no way that we can do this subject any real justice here other than kind of looking across the landscape of the work and, answering whatever specific questions I can. I will say that for people interested in UFOs, um, who study or who read his last book, called Contact with Space, it can be over romanticized. And I would say that it's probably the worst book to read first,
Ah,
because it's the culmination, again, of 45 years of work, going back to his brilliant years as uh, Freud's first assistant in the later 1920s in Vienna,
right.
and managing to escape, well, Hitler literally as the doors were closing, and then being a refugee in Europe for years until he was invited to speak, to be a instructor at the New School for Social Research in New York in 1941 or so. But for me, he was a millennial genius. And there is no other philosopher, scientist, social thinker who has had a more profound effect on my thinking and the way that I see the world as it is.
Hmm.
Um, Contact with Space, for what it's worth, was published a month after Reich died in 1957. It was published posthumously, and only 500 copies were ever printed. So if you have an original copy of it, hold on to it.
Hmm.
There are reproductions of the book that are available through the Wilhelm Reich Museum bookstore, which is
Hmm.
easy enough to find online. And I, my first 10 years of studying his work, um, really, the subject of his UFO involvement interested me least of all, because again, I was repressing that memory and that part of his work didn't interest me. And then quite radically, it did. And
Ah,
I ended up realizing I was obsessed in a way that was unhealthy with what the hell happened to my sister and what was this phenomena and what was it all about. And I, for the first time in my life, felt I really needed a therapist,
mhm.
and remembered Reich has had an involvement in this subject, and quite a remarkable one. And that his first assistant for the last 11 years of his life, I did a little looking into and learned that Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, in his later 70s, was alive and well and still practicing in the method that Reich had instructed him in, both in his home office in Red Bank, New Jersey, and an office that he had had for years on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. And after an initial contact with him, I decided to go into therapy with him, and did for almost 7 years. And it was one of the smartest and most valuable things I ever did for myself.
Mhm.
Um, I will also say that the Cloudbuster, which, along with the Orgone Energy Accumulator, often referred to, usually derogatorily, as the Orgone box, these are simple laboratory devices, but that is what remains of the very first Cloudbuster. It doesn't bear much of a resemblance to more modern ones. And the best I can do is tell you that the accumulator, which came first, and one made for a person, might be the size of an old-fashioned phone booth. It's basically layers of organic and inorganic material. For example, steel wool and plywood. And the more layers, the more potential it has for capturing and holding energy. Organic material holds energy, metallic material reflects energy, and they work. You feel a genuine uh, difference in the way that you feel. They can be applied to healing, to a better sense of well being, um, in some cases, fighting certain diseases and conditions. The cloudbuster is simply a series of long metal pipes and Reich experimented with different metals for some time before hitting on the ones that were optimum, that are then attached to hollow industrial level BX cable. We're all familiar with the BX cable that runs through our homes, but a actual working cloudbuster to address an atmospheric condition uses this larger cable material, very flexible, and they are simply attached at the back of these tubes, and the cables themselves, empty of the wiring, are then grounded in running water or a well or a pond. And the water is a natural energetic attractor. And when the pipes are aimed in a certain direction, it draws energy to it in the atmosphere. And in the case of a stagnant atmosphere, as we find in a drought, it gets the atmosphere moving again. And what Reich was able to do, and I only wish that there were more people in mainstream science that would at least try to replicate some of these experiments for themselves to see how brilliantly they work. It can break droughts. In fact, the leading individual in the world who did more of this work, certainly than Reich or anyone else, Dr. James DeMayo, whose laboratory, there's another variation, whose laboratory was outside of Ashland, Oregon, passed away earlier this year. Jim was an old friend of mine going back to the 70s, and he broke droughts over the years for the French government, the German government, Israel, Eritrea. It works. But because of the controversy, which is not unlike the controversy surrounding taking UFOs seriously, at least till recently, he always had to sign non-disclosure agreements, as far as major publicity of the fact that this technique breaks droughts. Reich was seen by officialdom to a degree at the time of his coming over to the United States as a potential security threat. He was the most virulent anti-communist person you could imagine, but he was an Eastern European guy, and you got to keep an eye on those people, and a doctor, and spoke with an accent, so you never know. But in the FDA at the time, because there is no question that in many cases of people who used orgone energy accumulators, orgone being a word for energy, it would be the same as the 19th century, the Victorians referring to the ether, or Hindu culture referring to the prana, that the orgone energy enhanced one's ability to build up tolerance to pleasure, something sadly that our culture is lacking in to a great degree, and experience fuller, more pleasurable orgasms, as well as a deeper sense of feeling in general. And so he was immediately labeled a sex quack in the 40s by the FDA, but they were never able to get anybody to complain. No patient, no individual that had ever worked with him or had ever used any of the medical equipment that working from his schematics or that was produced by his laboratory ever had an issue with it, ever. But then the FDA was able to push through legislation to at least halt interstate shipping as experimental medical devices, which is certainly fine. Unfortunately, one of his physicians completely forgot, and on a certain order, shipped panels for an accumulator from Rangeley, Maine to New York State, and they had him on a technicality. And Reich, who was brilliant, but in some ways idealistic in a way that did not serve him, decided that if he was going to trial, he would use it as an opportunity to prove the viability and the reality of the science that he had developed. And the judge would have none of it. He lost the case and was sentenced to a year in prison in
Where he died, right?
Yes, Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, where he was found dead in his cell about a week before he was scheduled for parole release. And don't, it's so easy to understand some folks jumping to the conclusion, myself as well originally, that this might have been some foul play. It might have been, but he, being imprisoned with a life dedicated to literally to freedom and nature and natural functioning, that had to be crushing to him. Plus, he was a chain smoker, shot a whiskey at night, heavy European diet, type A character, high blood pressure.
Mhm.
You don't need to look too far for conspiracy. Again, I will say I have used these devices and they work more as far as a cloudbuster goes. For 10 years, from my late 20s into my later 30s, I was reading this material, well, actually starting when I was 19, voraciously. And I understood and accepted the principles, the energetic principles that the cloudbuster operated under. But it's one thing to accept something intellectually and another thing to actually experience it or see it in action. And on a very memorable day in probably in the later 70s, a number of us who had worked as fundraisers for what went on to become the American College of Orgonomy in Princeton, New Jersey, which I have not had any association with for many years, but was proud to help put into effect. A local farmer who was a friend of the college allowed his property to be used for demonstration. And one of the best trained cloudbusters ever, a man who I still stay in touch with, who lives out in Oregon now, did a demonstration. It was trailer mounted on behind a pickup truck. It was operated from a cable drive with a long electrical wire. When it's operating, it can put out a somewhat toxic field, enough to make you not feel good,
Hmm.
and in extreme cases to give you a really bad sore throat or a headache or whatever. And it was very methodical. It was not, again, an operation to affect a major change in the weather in the area. But I'll tell you, Martin, it's indelible in my mind. At one point, starting out, John said, that cloud bank over there, over the next 10 minutes or so, I am going to remove. And then I'm going to create a cloud bank over here where there is none. Now I'm going to cut this cloud in half. And within maybe 2 minutes of drawing on it, not only did he do it, but if this cloudbuster had 10 pipes, I don't remember, we watched in complete awe as before it split in half, you could make out 10 rough, jagged holes for several moments and then dissipating and then two parts, and so on. It was something I
Wow.
will never forget. And on the other side of it, to manufacture one of these things can be deceptively simple, but to operate it responsibly, if you want to just show off and create some movement in the atmosphere, so to say, you can create damaging conditions. And
Well, I'd like to tell you a story if I could, real quickly, that had to do with this. And so when I was in my 20s, I'm trying to remember, kind of early 20s, I was a park ranger in California in the San Diego area. Lower Otay Lake was the name of the park. And so
cool.
I had to do a talk, and walk people over to the dam. And back in, oh God, it seems like it was 1913. Oh, by the way, I have a picture of myself as a ranger. Now, don't laugh too hard.
I won't.
Yeah, okay, because it's pretty funny.
I can't speak
I
to
have a
about the rest of your audience, though.
I have a tarantula on me, that a pet tarantula. Here it is right here.
Yes,
So that's me in my 20s. I'm at the park.
fabulous.
and I'm giving this talk on the dam and all that. And the the amazing thing is that they had a drought, a really bad drought, and they called a cloudbuster, and that the town or something was going to pay him something like 5,000, big money for back then, like $5,000. He did the cloudbuster. It rained so hard the dam burst and it killed like 120 farmers down river below the dam.
What?
So they of course didn't pay him. But that is a true story, and I used to tell it when I used to tour people out
Boy, I'd
toward the
never
dam.
heard that.
Yeah,
That's
Lower Otay,
terrible.
if you could look at it. Yeah, and it wasn't. I know that this was pre Wilhelm Reich, but it was some type of cloud thing that he supposedly shot up in the atmosphere. And
We're talking about when you say pre-Wilhelm Reich.
yeah, this was
When
in like 1913 or 15 or you know what I'm going
then
to do, Peter? We'll talk offline and I'll get all the information because I used to do the talk, but
you
you
know,
know that was that was 40
I,
years ago, you know.
to the best of my knowledge, no one had developed this technology back then, so
It
I don't
wasn't
know
called
what
a
you're.
cloudbuster, but it was something else. And it was something shot up into the atmosphere. And I will
Well,
get you that.
nothing is shot up into the atmosphere with a cloudbuster.
Yeah,
It's
it's a
simply,
total different thing, but still, it was quite a story I used to have to tell, and I'll look into that and get the details. But I know this is way off the UFO subject. I hope people are still enjoying it. But didn't he think that he could send the signals out to the UFOs or something like
well,
that,
there's no signals involved in that.
or the
We're
energy?
just
Yeah,
focusing energy, and it wasn't that he thought that he could. He did, and
he
it was
did.
multiply observed and documented repeatedly in Maine, as well as the following year near Tucson, where they had leased a space to use the cloudbuster specifically in one of the driest parts of the United States, so that if they produced the results they were after, which they did, they broke every weather record in the history of Arizona, it would be less in dispute. But yes, he did, and each time that he aimed the cloudbuster at a UFO, it either dimmed or wobbled or moved or disappeared.
Wow. That is something else. So there could be something now. Someone you said is very simplistic to create. Was there ever a patent on it that someone could reproduce something?
No, no,
No.
he did not take out a patent on the cloudbuster or the orgone energy accumulator. And with simple schematics, anybody can reproduce it. I would say if you have any interest in at least learning about it responsibly, the best book available ever published is the late Dr. James DeMayo's Orgone Energy Accumulator book. Um, and I think that's available from the Biophysical Orgone Biophysical Research Laboratory in Ashland, Maine, or just remember OBRL.
Hmm.
A huge archive and very well documented.
Yeah. So this kind of reminds me a little bit of Tesla. I was talking to my friend Donna today, and she brought that up. It's kind of like so another controversial. I mean, Tesla's papers, whatever happened to them, right after he died. What did
I,
they ascend on his property when he died?
they ascended on his property while he was alive
Ah,
and confiscated um, in the Eisenhower administration between, I think, 56 and 1960, a few months before Kennedy was inaugurated, something like 8 tons of original literature, hardcover books, medical journals, if they had even a reference to the term orgone energy, because the FDA had decided and declared that there was no such thing. Therefore, this was some kind of fraud, and his books were burned by the ton by
oh,
the United States government. And
Crazy.
It's a dark moment in scientific history, and one that most people have no awareness of at all. So, as far as Tesla goes, he died at the New Yorker Hotel in
Yeah.
1942, followed being hit by a car. And most smart money says it was the FBI that got into his room and cleaned out the safe. I will say, as a footnote, I know from my father, who used to delight in sharing with me and occasionally other people, that I was conceived in the Hotel New Yorker while he was AWOL, which means there's probably one chance in 300 or so, yes, that I was conceived in the room that Nikola Tesla was passed away in. I'll leave it at
It
that.
makes, yeah, that makes total sense, Peter. Yeah.
I, it's true.
Yeah. No.
I stayed there one night, and you know what I fell asleep thinking. Could this be the room? But,
Yeah.
you don't want to think about it too hard.
Yeah. Yeah. No, didn't he lived in a fairly big, like not a penthouse or anything like that, but a pretty sizable suite, wasn't
I
it?
have
But
no idea, but
yeah.
George Westinghouse could afford it, and George Westinghouse essentially robbed him of about $1 billion
Oh,
in patents.
absolutely. So much per
And
horsepower of every electric motor that was ever produced. I don't even know, it'd be in the trillions by now.
probably
Yeah.
Tesla was a millennial genius of a different sort, and at the same time, somewhat naive and idealistic. And what Westinghouse put to him in the earlier 1900s was, with your discoveries and a little thing I've created called General Electric, we can transform the world in a good way, but I'll go broke if you keep me, to our original agreement. So can I just pay you $1 million and we'll call it even?
Uh-huh.
That's right up there with buying Manhattan Island for $24 in beads, as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something else. We have I think we're just about out of time, Peter. This show went so fast with you, and I'd like to have you on sooner than later again, and we'll talk
I'd be
about
glad to.
other subjects. But right now, it's time for me to run this beautiful video showing this
Yeah.
poem dedicated to 9/11, which was just a couple of days ago. And one thing he did was he always posted this on his Facebook site every year at this time, 9/11. So this again is a tribute to a great man, Lea MacDonald, and here he is with his poem right here. And we'll be back next week, everyone, with Ben Hurl. And thank you so much. And what was it that he wanted me to say? Stare up in the air or something like that. But I'll say I would say it right for Lea if I could. And here we go.
Messenger vehicle responding to Manhattan with 12 rescue firefighters. I don't know what you gotta do, but I want all the rescue firefighters available from home to report, okay? We need all the help we can get. Manhattan dispatcher. Can 228 that by your message? We have a stage in the area just...
Calling all angels, went out his thunderous plea. I am thy Lord, beseeching my horde to assemble in front of me. In a flash the angels did dash to gather at his feet, and hear his plan to help all man by use of heaven's elite. The devil's made a play this September day to hurt the ones I love. He's loosed upon earth his demonic worth, now push has come to shove. I'll not stand by and have good men die without awareness in their heart. So this day, in my planful way, a battle I'm going to start. Gabriel, old friend, to this end welcome every woman and man that'll come our way this fateful day, who died by Satan's hand. And before you go, you need to know a few you'll bring straight to me. Firefighters all, now standing tall, knowing as the 343. With Gabriel gone and quiet the throng, they wondered at his plan to send and quell the flames of hell by use of mortal man. All manner of doubt filled the strongest and stout of heaven's holy array, and fear fell upon the heavenly throng at the plan the Lord set this day. I can sense in thy heart's hesitation to start a battle you don't understand, but confused as you, Satan is too, and that is the heart of my plan. Fear ye not for what I've wrought. I'll ask none here to face his fork, but I'll send into hell those who fell, the firefighters from New York. And the Lord raised his staff and began to laugh in roaring, thunderous glee. Then in a blaze they stepped from a haze, the angelic 343. They fell into line in very short time, making perfect formations of rows, and the Lord caused to slip on every man's hip a golden heavenly hose. The gravest mistake Satan did make when he struck down these men so brave, thinking idle I'd stand, not extending my hand, and their souls I would not save. Have no fear for the men standing here, the way to his place they know well. For verily, each day they've collected their pay by stepping into hell. These men know their task. Now, angels, I ask that you hasten straight to earth and comfort their friends when the tally begins and they start to question their worth. Console them with wings and all heavenly things. On their shoulder your head is to rest. Send whispers of thanks from our heavenly ranks. Say, God knows you did your best.